Human grit triumphs as alien beauty sweats diamonds from her armpits. In a world where human determination meets the awe-inspiring beauty of an alien warrior, witness the unimaginable unfold as a brave Earth operative teams up with a striking Xytheran beauty whose very sweat turns into diamonds. This is not your typical sci-fi adventure. This is a journey into the unknown, where raw human grit and otherworldly allure collide in a battle for survival, power, and secrets buried deep within the Crimson Wilds of Xythera-9. As the duo navigates perilous landscapes, faces dangerous enemies, and uncovers hidden treasures, they must rely on each other's strength and skills to overcome obstacles that no one thought possible. Will their bond be enough to overcome the odds, or will the overwhelming forces of the alien world crush them? From intense combat to breathtaking moments of connection, this thrilling adventure will keep you at the edge of your seat. Don't miss out on the epic journey ahead. Subscribe to our channel now to dive deeper into this heart-pounding, adrenaline-fueled saga. Join the adventure, and stay tuned for the next chapter in this exciting extraterrestrial story. Jake Blaze Carver stepped out of his drop pod, boots sinking into the crimson soil of Xythera-9. The air hit him like a wave, thick, humid, laced with a scent that stirred something deep in his chest, wild and untamed, like a call from the edge of the universe. His tactical suit clung to his broad shoulders and muscled frame, already damp from the heat of the twin red suns glaring down from a bruised sky. Around him, the forest pulsed with alien life. Trees glowed a deep, blood-red hue, their bioluminescent leaves casting shifting shadows across the ground. Strange creatures darted through the undergrowth, scaled wings fluttering, claws clicking, a chorus of sounds that set his nerves on edge. He adjusted his utility belt, feeling the reassuring weight of his pulse pistol against his hip. 17 uncharted worlds under his belt, and Jake still felt that familiar thrill, the rush of stepping into the unknown as an Earth intelligence operative. Xythera-9 was different, though. Rumors of a resource that could tip the scales in the Galactic Coalition had brought him here, a mission cloaked in mystery. "All right, Blaze," he muttered, his voice a low growl. "Let's see what this place is hiding." A rustle in the foliage snapped his attention forward. His hand hovered over his weapon, muscles tensing, but what emerged wasn't a threat. It was something else entirely. She stepped into the clearing with a predator's grace, her sky-blue skin catching the red light like a gemstone ablaze. Long, jet-black hair spilled down her back, brushing the curve of her hips. Her eyes, a vivid emerald green, pierced through him with an intensity that made his breath catch. Pointed ears peeked through her hair, sharp and elegant, marking her as distinctly alien. She stood tall, legs stretching endlessly beneath lightweight armor that hugged her frame, her chest full and prominent, her hips flaring into a backside that was both powerful and impossibly curved. She was stunning, a blend of strength and beauty that hit him like a shockwave. "I am Kalia," she said, her voice a melodic hum that seemed to vibrate in the air. "Your guide, human." She tilted her head, studying him with those green eyes, her expression unreadable. "You're late." Jake forced a grin, pushing down the jolt of attraction that surged through him. "Name's Blaze." Got held up navigating that junker of a drop pod. He kept his tone light, but his mind was racing. Earth's entry into the Coalition was still fresh, and Xytherans were a rarity, beings of legend more than fact. She was his first, and she carried an air of mystery that tugged at his curiosity. Kalia's lips twitched, a flicker of something, amusement maybe, crossing her face. "Keep up, Blaze. The Crimson Wilds don't coddle the slow." She turned and moved into the forest, her long legs cutting through the vines with ease. Jake followed, his eyes drawn to the way she moved. Fluid, confident, every step a silent challenge. He shook his head, focusing on the mission. "Eyes on the prize, man," he thought. Not on her. They trekked through the dense forest, the heat pressing down like a living thing. Jake's shirt clung to his chest, sweat beading on his brow, and he caught Kalia glancing back once, her gaze lingering on his frame before darting away. Earth's gravity is a beast compared to this, he said, breaking the silence as he adjusted his pack. Makes me feel like I could leap over these trees. She turned her head slightly, her green eyes catching his. Is that why your kind are so solid? Her voice held a trace of curiosity, her gaze flicking over his broad shoulders before returning to the path. Built for heavier worlds. Solid's one way to put it, he replied, flashing a grin. We're tough. Adaptable. Comes in handy out here. Their words danced around each other, a cautious testing of boundaries, each probing the other's edges. She didn't smile, but her ears twitched faintly, a sign, maybe, that she wasn't entirely immune to his charm. The forest thickened, red light filtering through towering ferns that pulsed faintly with energy. Small, winged creatures flitted overhead, their scales glinting like oil slicks. Kalia moved with purpose, her presence commanding the wild around them, until a guttural screech shattered the air. Jake's hand flew to his pistol, but Kalia reacted first. A massive spider-like creature erupted from the shadows, 8 legs tipped with claws, fangs dripping venom, its bulk looming over them like a nightmare. Stay back, Kalia shouted, drawing a sleek blade from her hip. Jake stepped forward, weapon raised, but she was already in motion. Her blade flashed, cutting through the air as she lunged at the beast. Her long legs propelled her with uncanny speed, her body twisting to dodge a swipe of its claws. Her armor stretched tight across her chest as she moved, her breathing sharp and controlled. She drove her blade into the creature's side, pinning it to the ground with a final, powerful thrust. Sweat glistened on her blue skin, trickling down her neck, and then Jake saw it. From beneath her arm, where armor left a sliver of skin bare, a drop of sweat rolled free, catching the red light. It fell to the ground and hardened instantly, transforming into a tiny, flawless diamond that sparkled against the dirt. Another followed, then another, each bead of perspiration from her armpit crystallizing as it hit the soil, scattering like a handful of stars. Jake's jaw dropped, his pistol lowering slightly. What the? He breathed, staring at the gems. His mind scrambled to process it. Sweat turning into diamonds? He'd seen a lot in his career, but this was beyond anything he'd imagined. Kalia straightened, wiping her blade on the creature's hide, unaware of his gaze at first. Then she noticed, and her face shifted, the blue of her skin flushing a faint pink. Don't stare, she said sharply, crossing her arms in a defensive gesture that only drew his attention more. It's nothing. Just a reaction. Nothing. Jake stepped closer, his voice low, tinged with awe. Kalia, that's not nothing. You just turned sweat into diamonds. He stopped a respectful distance away, his eyes locked on hers, though he couldn't help noticing the way her posture accentuated her form. On Earth, that's the kind of thing wars are fought over. It's shameful to us, she replied, her tone stiff, her ears twitching with discomfort. A bodily quirk. We don't speak of it. She turned away, adjusting her stance as if to shield herself from his scrutiny. Jake tilted his head, studying her. Shameful? I'd call it extraordinary. His voice softened, genuine curiosity lacing his words. You're extraordinary. He didn't push closer, didn't reach out. Not yet. But the air between them shifted, a thread of connection forming amidst her guardedness and his intrigue. Kalia didn't respond, her green eyes narrowing slightly as she assessed him. You humans are different, she said at last, her voice quieter now, laced with something he couldn't quite place. Wary interest, perhaps. Too bold for your own good. Bold's what keeps us alive out here, he said, offering a small smile. You'll see. He let the moment hang, sensing her walls were still up, and backed off to give her space. She was a puzzle, one he wanted to solve, but not by rushing in. They continued their journey, reaching a clearing by a glowing red stream. We'll rest here, Kalia said, kneeling to fill her canteen. Jake crouched beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her, but he kept his hands to himself, settling for a sidelong glance. Her hair fell over one shoulder, framing her face, and he caught the faintest hint of that sweet scent from her earlier exertion. "You handled that thing back there like it was nothing," he said, his tone casual but impressed. "Where'd you learn to fight like that?" She glanced at him, her expression softening just a fraction. "The wilds teach us young. Survival isn't a choice here, it's a necessity." Her voice carried a weight, a glimpse into her world, and Jake nodded, filing it away. "Sounds like Earth in some ways," he replied, leaning back on his heels. "We got our own monsters, just not as ugly as that one." He flashed a grin, and this time, her lips curved ever so slightly, a crack in her armor, small but real. The stream murmured between them, the forest settling into a tense quiet. Jake checked his navigation device, his mind buzzing with questions about the diamonds, about her people, about her. Whatever Xythera-9 held, he knew one thing. Kalia wasn't just a guide. She was a mystery, a challenge, and maybe, just maybe, something more. As she stood, stretching her arms and giving him a fleeting view of her striking silhouette, he felt that spark again. This mission was going to test him in ways he hadn't expected, and he was ready for every damn second of it. The red glow of the stream flickered across Kalia's sky-blue skin as she settled onto a flat stone, her canteen resting in her lap. Jake watched her for a moment, the way her long legs folded beneath her, the faint sheen of sweat still clinging to her neck from the fight. That diamond trick, sweat turning to gems under her arm, was still rattling around in his head, a puzzle he couldn't quite let go of. But it wasn't just that. There was something about her presence, a mix of strength and quiet reserve, that pulled at him like gravity. He shook it off, crouching to splash water from the stream onto his face, the coolness a sharp contrast to the humid air. "Water's safe here," Kalia said, her voice cutting through the stillness. She didn't look up, focused on tightening the cap on her canteen. "The wilds purify it. Keeps us alive." Jake wiped his face with the back of his hand, glancing at her. "Good to know. Last planet I was on, the water dam near melted my boots." He flashed a grin, settling onto a rock across from her. Xythera started to look like a step up. Her green eyes flicked to him, a trace of curiosity in their depths. "You've been to many worlds?" she asked, her tone neutral but tinged with interest. Her ears twitched slightly, catching the faint hum of the forest around them. 17, he replied, leaning back on his hands, his damp shirt stretching across his chest. "Some were hellholes, acid rain, bugs the size of my head. Others were quieter, but none like this." He gestured at the glowing trees, the air thick with that primal scent. "This place feels alive, like it's watching us." Kalia nodded, her gaze drifting to the canopy. "It is. The wilds are more than just plants and beasts. They are connected. My people believe they speak in their own way." She paused, then added, softer, "You do well to respect them." "Respect's my middle name," Jake said, his grin widening. "Well, not really. It's Michael, but I can play nice when it counts." He caught the faintest curve of her lips, barely a smile, but enough to tell him she wasn't entirely immune to his charm. It was a start. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the stream's murmur blending with the distant calls of unseen creatures. Jake pulled a ration bar from his pack, tearing it open with his teeth. "Want one?" he offered, holding it out. "Tastes like cardboard, but it'll keep you going." Kalia eyed the bar, her nose wrinkling slightly. "Your food looks unappealing," she said, but she reached out anyway, her fingers brushing his as she took it. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him, a spark he hadn't expected. She pulled back quickly, inspecting the bar like it might bite her. "Unappealing's generous," he chuckled, taking a bite of his own. "But it's fuel. You Xytherans probably eat something fancier, glowing fruit. Maybe roasted spider legs." She let out a small huff, almost a laugh. "We eat what the wilds provide, roots, berries, meat when we hunt. Simple, but ours." She nibbled at the ration bar, her expression shifting to mild disgust. "This is not simple. It's punishment." Jake laughed, a deep, warm sound that echoed through the clearing. "Fair. Stick with me." and I'll find you something better. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes locking with hers. So, what's it like growing up here? All this red, all this wild. Kalia set the bar aside, her gaze distant for a moment. It's home. Harsh but beautiful. We learn young to fight, to survive. The wilds don't forgive weakness. She glanced at him, her voice steady but softer now. What about your Earth? What shapes a human like you? He considered her question, rubbing the back of his neck. Earth's a mess sometimes. Cities packed tight, skies full of smoke. But it's toughened us up, made us scrappy. You learn to think fast, fight hard, or you're done. He shrugged, a half-smile tugging at his lips. Guess that's why I'm out here, poking around places like this. She tilted her head, studying him with those piercing green eyes. You're not like the others we've met, coalition scouts, traitors. They're cold, distant. You talk too much. Guilty as charged, he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. Keeps me sane out here. Plus, I figure if I'm stuck with a guide as sharp as you, I might as well get to know her. Her ears twitched again, and she looked away, but not before he caught a flicker of warmth in her expression. Sharp? HM? Careful, Blaze. Flattery doesn't work on Xytherans. Worth a shot, he replied, his tone light, but his gaze steady. There was a rhythm to their words now, a push and pull that felt like the start of something. Trust, maybe, or at least the seeds of it. The rest didn't last long. Kalia stood, brushing dirt from her armor, her movements drawing as despite his best efforts. The way her chest rose with each breath, the curve of her hips as she turned. It was damn near impossible to ignore. But he kept his distance, letting her set the pace. She nodded toward the path ahead. We need to move. The next ridge is half a day's trek. Jake grabbed his pack, slinging it over his shoulder. Lead on, boss. He fell in a step behind her, the forest closing in around them once more. The air grew heavier as they climbed, the red light dimming under thicker canopies. They moved in silence for a while, the only sounds their boots against the soil and the occasional rustle of leaves. Jake's mind kept drifting back to that fight, those diamonds falling from her armpit like some cosmic trick. He wanted to ask more, but her guarded reaction earlier told him to tread lightly. Halfway up the ridge, the terrain shifted. Vines hung low, tangled and slick with glowing sap. Kalia slowed, her blade flashing out to cut a path. Stay close, she warned, her voice firm. The wilds get trickier here. Close is my specialty, he quipped, stepping nearer until their shoulders nearly brushed. She shot him a sidelong glance, her green eyes narrowing, but she didn't pull away. They navigated the vines together, Jake ducking under a low-hanging tendril as Kalia sliced through another. At one point, the path narrowed, forcing them to squeeze through a tight gap between two massive, glowing trunks. She went first, her body twisting gracefully, and Jake followed, his chest brushing her back for a fleeting second. He caught the faint scent of her, sweet, earthy, like the forest itself, and his pulse kicked up a notch. Sorry, he muttered, though he wasn't entirely sure he meant it. She didn't respond, but her ears flicked, and he swore he saw her blue skin flush faintly again. On the other side, the forest opened into a plateau, the red light softer here, filtered through thinner leaves. Kalia paused, catching her breath, and Jake took the chance to study her closer. Sweat beaded on her brow, a drop sliding down her neck, disappearing beneath her armor. He wondered if it would happen again. Those diamonds, but nothing fell this time. Maybe it took more effort, more strain. His curiosity burned, but he held his tongue, sensing she'd clam up if he pushed too hard. Nice view, he said instead, nodding at the expanse of forest stretching below them. The plateau offered a rare vantage point, the crimson canopy rolling out like a sea of fire under the twin suns. Kalia followed his gaze, her expression softening. It is one of the few places the wilds let you breathe. She sat on a fallen log, stretching her long legs out in front of her, and Jake joined her, keeping a small gap between them. He could feel the heat of her presence, though, and it was enough to keep his thoughts spinning. So, he started, leaning forward slightly. Those diamonds that happen a lot? His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp, watching her reaction. She tensed, her hands tightening around her blade's hilt. Not often, she said curtly. Only when I push myself. It's a flaw. Something we're taught to hide. Flaw? Jake raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. Kalia, that's no flaw. That's a damn superpower. You're walking around making treasure out of nothing. He kept his voice light, but there was an edge of admiration in it, real, unforced. She looked at him then, her green eyes searching his face. You don't understand. To us, it's crude, unnatural. A reminder we're tied to this place in ways we can't escape. Her voice dropped, a rare crack in her composure, and Jake felt a pang of something, sympathy, maybe, or just the urge to know her better. Maybe I don't get it, he admitted, meeting her gaze. But where I'm from, that'd make you a legend. Hell, already does. He offered a small smile, not pressing further, letting her words settle between them. For a moment, she didn't respond, just watched him with that unreadable stare. Then she nodded, almost imperceptibly. You're not what I expected from a human, she said, her tone quieter now, like she was turning the thought over in her mind. Glad to surprise you, he replied, his grin softening into something warmer. Stick around. I got more where that came from. She huffed, a sound that might have been a laugh if she'd let it grow, and stood, brushing off her armor. We'll see. Come on. Night's falling soon. She started down the path again, and Jake followed, feeling the distance between them shrink just a little. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was enough to keep him hooked. They reached a small cave as the suns dipped below the horizon, the red light fading to a deep, pulsing glow. We'll camp here, Kalia said, setting her pack down. Jake nodded, dropping his own gear, and they worked in tandem to clear a space, silent but comfortable now, like two pieces starting to fit. He caught her glancing at him as he bent to gather dry vines for a fire, her eyes lingering on his arms, his back. When their gazes met, she looked away quickly, but not before he saw that faint flush again. The fire crackled to life, casting shadows across the cave walls. Jake sat across from her, the flames dancing between them, and felt that spark grow, a slow burn, not a blaze, but it was there. He didn't push, didn't need to. Whatever was building between them, it would come in its own time. For now, he was content to watch her, to listen, to let the wilds and Kalia reveal themselves one step at a time. But as the firelight played across her blue skin, highlighting the curve of her jaw, the strength in her frame, he knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The cave glowed faintly under the flickering firelight, the red pulse of the Crimson Wilds seeping through the entrance like a living heartbeat. Jake Blaze, Carver leaned back against a rough stone wall, his pulse pistol resting on his thigh, its cool metal a steady anchor in the alien night. Across from him, Kalia sat cross-legged, her sky-blue skin catching the warm hues of the flames. Her emerald-green eyes were fixed on the fire, her pointed ears twitching now and then as distant sounds filtered in from the forest. Chirps, rustles, the occasional low growl of something unseen. She'd been quiet since they'd settled in, her usual sharpness softened by the stillness, and Jake couldn't help but watch her, tracing the lines of her face, the way her long, black hair framed her jaw. 2 days on Xythera-9, and he was already hooked, not just on the mission, but on her. That diamond trick from her armpit still lingered in his mind, a wild, impossible detail he couldn't shake. But it was more than that now. Their talks, her guarded glances, the way she'd started to let him in, inch by inch, it was building something between them, a thread he wasn't ready to cut. He shifted slightly, the movement drawing her gaze, and for a moment their eyes locked. There was a question in hers, a flicker of curiosity, and he offered a small grin to ease the silence. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, his voice low, roughened by the day's trek. "Or whatever passes for currency out here." Kalia tilted her head, her lips curving just enough to hint at amusement. "You humans and your sayings," she murmured. "I was thinking about the wilds. They're restless tonight. more than usual. She glanced toward the cave mouth, her ears twitching again. Something's coming. Jake straightened, his hand tightening on the pistol. Trouble? He asked, scanning the shadows beyond the fire's reach. The air felt heavier now, that primal scent thicker, pressing against his senses like a warning. Maybe, she said, her tone measured but sharp. The wilds don't lie. When they stir, it's for a reason. She stood, her long legs unfolding gracefully, and moved to the entrance, her silhouette framed against the red glow outside. Her armor hugged her frame, accentuating the strength in her stance. And Jake found himself following her without a second thought, his boots scuffing the dirt. He joined her at the cave mouth, standing close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her, though he kept his hands to himself. The forest beyond was a sea of crimson, the trees pulsing faintly, their light casting eerie patterns across the ground. Anything specific you're picking up? He asked, his voice steady but alert. Or just a gut feeling? Kalia didn't answer right away, her green eyes narrowing as she scanned the horizon. A hum, she said at last. Low, mechanical, not natural. She pointed to the northwest, where the canopy seemed to ripple slightly, a disturbance too subtle for human ears to catch. There, Jake squinted, straining to hear it, and after a moment, he caught it, a faint, steady drone, growing louder with each passing second. His instincts kicked in, years of fieldwork sharpening his focus. That's no animal, he muttered, pulling his navigation device from his belt. The screen flickered to life, a faint signal pulsing in the direction she'd indicated. Tech moving fast. Coalition. Not ours, Kalia said, her voice hardening. Xytherans don't use machines like that in the wilds. It's foreign. She stepped back, her hand resting on the hilt of her blade, and Jake felt the shift in her, wary, defensive, like a predator sensing a rival. All right, he said, holstering the device and drawing his pistol. Let's get a better look. If it's trouble, we'll handle it. He flashed her a grin, the kind that had gotten him through tighter spots than this. You and me, huh? She met his gaze, her expression softening for a split second before the steel returned. Stay sharp, Blaze, she said, but there was a trace of something warmer in her tone. Trust, maybe, or at least the start of it. She turned and led the way out, her movements silent and sure, and Jake followed, the hum growing into a rumble that vibrated through his boots. They moved quickly, weaving through the glowing ferns and tangled vines, the forest seeming to close in around them. The air buzzed with tension, that pheromone-laden scent sharpening his senses, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not just by the wilds, but by something else. Kalia stayed a step ahead, her blade glinting in the red light, and Jake kept pace, his eyes darting between her and the shadows. Every so often, she'd glance back, a silent check to make sure he was still there, and he'd nod, a quiet reassurance passing between them. The hum grew louder, a mechanical whine that cut through the natural chorus of the forest, and they crested a low ridge just in time to see it, a sleek, black craft slicing through the canopy, its engines glowing a sickly green. It was no coalition ship. The design was jagged, insect-like, with sharp angles that screamed aggression. Jake crouched beside Kalia behind a glowing trunk, his pistol ready, and she pressed close, her shoulder brushing his. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through him, a reminder of how close they'd gotten in just a few days. Scoreth, Kalia whispered, her voice tight with recognition. They're scavengers, exploiters. I've seen their kind before, raiding outer settlements, stripping them bare. Her green eyes flashed with anger, her grip tightening on her blade. Scoreth, huh? Jake muttered, peering at the craft as it slowed, hovering above a clearing a few hundred yards away, not ringing any bells from the coalition briefs. Off-the-grid types. He adjusted his grip on the pistol, his mind already running through scenarios. Hostile, likely armed, definitely trouble. They don't answer to your coalition, she said, her tone bitter. They take what they want, resources, tech lives. We've kept them out of the wilds, until now. She shifted, her armor creaking faintly, and Jake caught the faint scent of her again, sweet, earthy, a mix of exertion and something uniquely her. "Guess they didn't get the memo," he said, his voice low but steady. "What's their play here? Those diamonds of yours?" He kept his tone casual, but his eyes flicked to her, watching for her reaction. Kalia stiffened, her ears twitching. "Maybe," she admitted, reluctance heavy in her voice. "Our kind, we've heard rumors. Scoreth traders sniffing around the edges of our territory, asking about blue-skinned jewel makers. I didn't think they'd dare come this far." She looked away, her jaw tightening, and Jake saw the conflict in her, the shame she'd hinted at before, now tangled with fear. "Hey," he said, his voice softening, drawing her gaze back to him. "If they're after that, they'll have to go through us first. I'm not big on letting scavengers take what's not theirs." He held her eyes, letting her see the steel behind his words, the promise of a man who'd fought for less and won. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then nodded. "You're braver than you look, human," she said, a faint edge of respect in her tone. "Or more foolish." "Little of both," he replied, flashing that crooked grin again. "Keeps life interesting." She didn't smile, but her ears relaxed slightly, and he took it as a win, a small crack in her walls, widening with every step they took together. The Scoreth craft descended, its engines kicking up dust and leaves as it settled into the clearing. Jake and Kalia crept closer, staying low behind a cluster of glowing ferns. The ship's hatch hissed open, and a figure emerged, tall, hunched, clad in dark, segmented armor that gleamed like a beetle's shell. Its face was a nightmare, mandibles clicking, eyes glowing red in sunken sockets, a voice like grinding metal cutting through the air as it barked orders to a squad of similarly grotesque soldiers. "Zargith," Kalia whispered, her voice barely audible. "Their commander." Jake's jaw tightened, his grip on the pistol steady. "Looks like a real charmer," he muttered, sizing up the enemy. The Scoreth moved with purpose, unloading crates and strange, humming devices, tools, maybe or weapons. "What's their next move?" "Scouting," Kalia said, her eyes narrowing. "They'll search for signs, settlements, resources. If they know about the diamonds," she trailed off, her hand tightening on her blade, and Jake felt a surge of protectiveness he hadn't expected, not just for the mission, but for her. "Then we don't give him the chance," he said, his voice firm. "We watch, we plan, we hit him where it hurts. You in?" She met his gaze, her green eyes fierce and resolute. "Always," she replied, and for the first time he saw something like trust flicker in her, a spark that matched the one growing in him. Jake nodded, a silent pact sealing between them as they turned their attention back to the Scoreth below. The clearing buzzed with activity now, soldiers scuttling like ants, unloading more crates, their mandibles clicking in a rhythm that set his teeth on edge. Zargith stood at the center, his armored form towering over his crew, barking orders in that grinding, metallic voice. Jake couldn't make out the words, but the intent was clear. They were here to take, not to talk. He shifted his weight, the pulse pistol humming faintly in his grip, and glanced at Kalia. Her jaw was tight, her blade still clutched in her hand, and he could feel the tension radiating off her like heat. "We need to get closer," he whispered, keeping his voice low. "Figure out what they're unpacking. Could be weapons, scanners, something to sniff out those diamonds." He tilted his head toward her, his eyes searching hers. "You good for a little recon?" Kalia's ears twitched, her gaze flicking between him and the clearing. "I can move quieter than you," she said, a trace of challenge in her tone. "But you're right. We need to know." She sheathed her blade with a soft click, opting for stealth over steel, and crouched lower, her long legs coiling like springs. "Follow my lead. Step where I step." "Got it," Jake replied, holstering his pistol to free his hands. He mirrored her stance, his muscles flexing under his damp shirt as he prepared to move. She started down the slope, a shadow blending into the red glow, and he followed, keeping his steps light despite the bulk of his frame. The forest seemed to hold its breath as they crept closer, the hum of the Scoreth craft growing into a steady drone that vibrated through the ground. They reached a cluster of glowing ferns just above the clearing, close enough to see the details of the Scorith operation. Zargith paced near the ship, his red eyes glinting as he inspected a crate being pried open by two soldiers. Inside, Jake caught a glimpse of sleek, cylindrical devices, humming faintly, their surfaces etched with strange runes. "Scanners," he murmured, glancing at Kalia. Her face darkened, her green eyes narrowing. "Worse," she whispered back. "Stimulators. I've seen them used on captured Xytherans, outliers caught beyond the wilds. They force the reaction." "We won't let him," he said, his voice firm, cutting through her silence. He met her gaze, holding it steady. "We'll figure this out together." It wasn't just bravado. It was a promise, one he intended to keep. She didn't respond, but the way her shoulders relaxed, just a fraction, told him she'd heard it, and maybe even believed it. Their plan was cut short by a sudden shift in the clearing. Zargith's head snapped up, his mandibles clicking rapidly as he pointed toward the ridge, straight at them. "Intruders!" he roared, his voice like metal scraping stone, and the soldiers dropped their crates, drawing jagged, glowing weapons. Jake's heart slammed against his ribs, adrenaline surging as he grabbed Kalia's arm. "Move!" he hissed, pulling her back. They bolted, scrambling up the slope, but the Scorith were fast, too fast. A squad broke off, skittering through the ferns with unnatural speed, their weapons humming as they closed in. Jake shoved Kalia behind a tree, drawing his pistol and firing a burst of plasma bolts. One soldier screeched, its armored chest smoking as it fell, but the others pressed on, relentless. "Go!" he shouted, shoving her toward the path. "I'll cover you." "No!" Kalia snapped, her blade flashing out as she spun back. "We fight together." She lunged at a Scorith soldier, her movements a blur of blue and steel, slicing through its arm before it could fire. Jake grinned despite the chaos. Damn, she was something else, but the moment was fleeting. More soldiers swarmed up the slope, their numbers overwhelming. A sharp whine cut through the air, and Jake turned just in time to see a net launcher fire from the clearing below. The glowing web shot toward them, too fast to dodge. "Kalia!" he yelled, lunging to push her out of the way, but she was a step ahead, twisting to shield him instead. The net caught her mid-move, wrapping tight around her arms and legs, pinning her to the ground with a thud. She grunted, struggling against the bonds, her green eyes blazing with fury. "Kalia!" Jake roared, firing at the soldiers closing in, but a heavy blow slammed into his back. A Scorith club, wielded by a soldier he hadn't seen. Pain exploded through him, and he hit the dirt hard, blood trickling from his lip as his pistol skittered out of reach. He scrambled to his knees, reaching for her, but the soldiers were on her now, dragging her toward the clearing. "Let her go, you bastards!" he bellowed, lunging forward, only to take another hit. This time to the head, stars bursting in his vision. Through the haze, he saw Zargith stride up the slope, his red eyes glinting with cold triumph. "The human and the jewel maker," he rasped, his mandibles clicking as he loomed over Jake. "You'll fetch a fine price, after we've taken what's ours." He gestured to his soldiers, and they hauled Kalia to her feet, her struggles muffled by the net. She locked eyes with Jake, her expression a mix of defiance and something softer. Fear, maybe, or a plea he couldn't answer. Jake surged up, ignoring the pain, but a soldier pinned him down, its claw digging into his shoulder. "You're dead," he spat at Zargith, blood dripping from his mouth. "You hear me? I'll tear you apart." His voice cracked with rage, but the Scorith commander only laughed, a grating, hollow sound, as Kalia was dragged toward the ship. The last thing Jake saw before darkness took him was her blue form disappearing into the craft, her green eyes still fixed on him, burning with a fire he swore he'd match. They'd taken her, but they wouldn't keep her, not if he had anything to say about it. Darkness clung to Jake Blaze, Carver like a second skin, thick and heavy, pierced only by the throbbing ache in his skull. He groaned, rolling onto his side, the taste of blood sharp on his tongue as dirt gritted against his cheek. The forest floor beneath him pulsed faintly, the red glow of the Crimson Wilds seeping through his blurred vision. His shoulder burned where the Scorth soldier's claw had dug in, and his ribs ached from the club that had sent him sprawling. But none of that mattered. Not the pain, not the blood. All he could see was Kalia's green eyes, fierce and desperate, staring back at him as those insect bastards dragged her away. "Damn it," he muttered, his voice a ragged growl as he pushed himself up. His hands scrabbled in the dirt, finding his pulse pistol a few feet away, its grip still warm from his last shots. He clutched it tight, the weight grounding him as his mind raced. Zargatha's grating laugh echoed in his ears. "You'll fetch a fine price, after we've taken what's ours." Those stimulators, the way Kalia's voice had tightened when she described them, it wasn't hard to piece together what the Scorth wanted. Her diamonds, her strength, her. The thought lit a fire in his gut, raw and unrelenting. They'd taken her, but they wouldn't keep her, not while he was still breathing. Jake staggered to his feet, wiping blood from his lip with the back of his hand. The clearing below was empty now, the Scorth craft gone, leaving only churned soil and a faint hum lingering in the air. His navigation device was still clipped to his belt, cracked but functional, and he pulled it free, squinting at the flickering screen. A faint signal pulsed northwest, moving fast but steady. "Got you," he muttered, his jaw tightening. He didn't know how far they'd taken her, but he tracked worse through worse. Earth intelligence didn't churn out quitters, and he wasn't about to start now. The forest was eerily quiet as he started moving, the red glow dimming as night deepened. Every step sent a jolt of pain through his battered body, but he pushed it down, focusing on the signal, on her. Kalia's face flashed in his mind, her sharp wit, the way her ears twitched when he teased her, that flicker of trust he'd seen just before everything went to hell. She wasn't just a guide anymore, not just a mission asset. She was his partner in this, and he'd be damned if he let those scavengers break her. He trekked for hours, the signal growing stronger as the terrain shifted, flatlands giving way to jagged hills dotted with glowing caves. The hum returned, louder now, and he crested a rise to see it, a Scorth outpost nestled in a shallow valley, its black spires jutting up like claws against the crimson sky. The craft from earlier sat docked beside a cluster of squat, metallic structures, its green engines idling with a low thrum. Soldiers scurried around the perimeter, their segmented armor glinting under floodlights, and Jake's grip tightened on his pistol. This was no scouting party. It was a base, fortified and buzzing with purpose. "All right, Blaze," he whispered to himself, crouching behind a glowing boulder. "Time to get creative." He scanned the outpost, his mind ticking through options. Charging and guns blazing was a death sentence. Too many of them, too little cover. But he'd infiltrated worse back on Earth, pirate dens, cartel strongholds. And he'd learned one thing. Every fortress had a weak spot. He just had to find it. The perimeter was tight, but not perfect. A drainage grate sat near the eastern edge, half hidden by tangled vines, its bars rusted and bent. Jake slipped down the hill, keeping low, his boots silent against the soil. The air here was thicker, laced with a sharp, chemical tang that stung his nose, something synthetic, unnatural. He reached the grate, testing it with a tug. It groaned but gave just enough for him to squeeze through. "Thank you, shoddy maintenance," he muttered, wedging his shoulders into the narrow gap and pulling himself inside. The tunnel was cramped, damp, and reeked of decay, but it sloped upward, leading into the heart of the base. Jake crawled, his pistol clutched in one hand, his breath shallow to keep the noise down. The walls vibrated faintly, the hum of machinery growing louder, and he emerged into a shadowed maintenance bay, crates stacked high, pipes hissing with steam. Two Scorth soldiers stood near a console, their backs to him, mandibles clicking as they chattered in their grating tongue. Jake didn't hesitate. He sprang up, slamming the butt of his pistol into one's head, dropping it with a dull thud, then fired a silenced shot into the other's chest. It collapsed, green ichor pooling beneath it, and he dragged both bodies behind a crate, his heart pounding. "Two down," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. His shirt was soaked now, clinging to his muscled frame, and he could feel the bruises forming under his skin. But he was in step one complete. He checked his device again, the signal pulsing stronger now, pinpointing a chamber deeper in the base. That's where she'd be. He moved fast, sticking to the shadows, his training kicking in as he navigated the maze of corridors. The outpost was a hive of activity, soldiers hauling equipment, machines whirring with purpose. But Jake was a ghost, slipping past patrols with a mix of luck and skill. He reached a sealed door, its surface etched with those same runes he'd seen on the stimulators, and his gut twisted. Whatever was behind it, it wasn't good. He pulled a small charge from his belt, a standard-issue breaching tool, and pressed it to the lock, stepping back as it beeped softly. The door hissed open with a faint pop, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. Jake took the stairs two at a time, the air growing colder, heavier, that chemical tang sharper now. Voices echoed up, Xythera's unmistakable, barking orders in that metallic rasp. Jake slowed, peering around the corner into a cavernous chamber lit by harsh green lights. Crates lined the walls, filled with those stimulator devices, and at the center stood a platform, a lab, rigged with tubes and wires, a nightmare of cold efficiency. And there she was. Kalia hung suspended in the middle, her arms and legs bound by glowing restraints, her sky-blue skin stark against the machinery. Her armor was gone, stripped away, leaving her in a thin undersuit that clung to her frame, highlighting every curve, the strength in her legs, the fullness of her chest, the power in her stance even now. Her head was bowed, her black hair falling over her face, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders, the fight still burning in her despite the odds. A tube snaked from a nearby console, pumping a faint mist around her, and as it hit her skin, sweat beaded under her arms, dripping free and hardening into diamonds that clinked against the metal floor. Jake's blood boiled, his fists clenching so hard his knuckles cracked. "Bastards!" he hissed under his breath, his eyes locked on her. Xythera stood below the platform, his red eyes glinting as he watched the gems fall, a soldier collecting them into a crate. "More!" Xythera snarled, his mandibles clicking. "Increase the dose. She's stronger than the others. Let's see how much she can give." Kalia's head lifted slightly, her green eyes hazy but defiant, and Jake's heart lurched. She didn't see him, not yet, but he saw her, every inch of her fighting to hold on. He'd promised her they'd face this together, and he'd failed her once. Not again. He slipped back into the shadows, his mind racing, plotting. The Scoreth thought they'd won, but they didn't know him, didn't know what a human could do when you push him too far. He'd get her out, whatever it took. Jake's vision swam, the green lights of the Scoreth lab blurring into streaks as he crouched in the shadows, every muscle coiled tight. The sight of Kalia bound, stripped down, her sky-blue skin glistening with forced sweat under that damn mist, lit a fire in him that burned hotter than the pain racking his body. Those bastards were draining her, turning her strength into profit, and Xythera's smug rasp only fueled the rage clawing at his chest. He forced himself to breathe, to think. Charging him blind would get them both killed. He needed a plan fast. The chamber buzzed with activity, soldiers scuttling around crates, Xythera pacing below the platform, his red eyes glinting like embers. Jake scanned the room, his sharp eyes catching on a control panel near the back, wires snaking from it to the tubes, pumping mist around Kalia. That was it. Cut the power, stop the stimulators by the shot. He slipped along the wall, sticking to the shadows, his boots silent against the cold metal floor. His shirt clung to his chest, soaked with sweat and blood, but he ignored it, his focus razor-sharp. A soldier lumbered past, its mandibles clicking, and Jake struck, slamming his pistol into its skull with a muffled crack, then dragging it behind a crate. One less problem. He reached the panel, his fingers flying over the unfamiliar controls, guided by instinct and a lifetime of fieldwork. A low beep sounded, and the mist faltered, the tubes hissing as they slowed. Kalia's head lifted, her green eyes clearing slightly, and Jake's heart kicked up a notch. She saw him now, her gaze locking onto his, a flicker of hope cutting through the haze. "Hold on," he mouthed, ducking as Xytheran's head snapped toward the panel. "Malfunction," the Scorith commander snarled, his voice grinding like gears. "Fix it now." Soldiers scrambled, but Jake was already moving, weaving through the chaos toward the platform. He needed her free, needed her fighting beside him. That's how they'd win, together. He reached the base of the platform, vaulting onto it with a grunt, his bruised ribs protesting. Kalia strained against her restraints, her long legs flexing, her chest rising with shallow breaths. Up close, she was a vision, her undersuit clinging to every curve, her full breasts and powerful hips stark against the harsh lights, her blue skin shimmering with sweat. But it was her eyes that held him, fierce and unbroken despite everything. "Jake," she rasped, her voice weak but alive. "I've got you," he said, his tone low and steady as he sliced through the glowing restraints with a vibra knife from his belt. The bond snapped free, and she slumped into his arms, her weight pressing against him, soft, warm, real. His hands slid to her hips, steadying her, and he couldn't help the jolt that shot through him as his fingers brushed the curve of her backside, firm and impossibly smooth. "You okay?" he asked, his voice rough, his eyes searching hers. "Better now," she murmured, her breath hot against his neck. She straightened, her strength returning, and Jake felt her shift, her chest brushing his, her long legs finding their footing. His hands lingered a moment longer, sliding up to grip her waist, then higher, grazing the sides of her breasts through the thin fabric. She shivered, her green eyes flaring with something more than relief, and for a heartbeat, the chaos around them faded. Just the two of them, locked in that charged space. A soldier screech snapped them back. Jake spun, firing a plasma bolt that dropped it mid-lunge, and Kalia grabbed a jagged shard of metal from the platform, her movements fluid despite the ordeal. "We're not done," she said, her voice hardening, and Jake grinned, wild, fierce alive. "Damn right we're not," he replied, pulling her close for one fleeting second, his hand cupping her backside, squeezing hard enough to feel her tense against him. She let out a sharp breath, her ears twitching, and he felt that spark ignite, a promise of more, later, when they weren't fighting for their lives. The chamber erupted. Soldiers swarmed the platform, their glowing weapons humming, and Xytheran roared, his armored form charging through the fray. Jake and Kalia moved as one, him blasting away with his pistol, her slashing with that shard like it was an extension of her body. She was a whirlwind, her long legs propelling her into a leap that took down two soldiers, her sweat beading under her arms as she fought. A drop fell, hardening into a diamond that glinted as it hit the floor, and Jake's grin widened. "Keep shining, beautiful," he called, ducking a swipe from a Scorith claw. Xytheran reached them, his mandibles snapping as he swung a massive, jagged blade. Jake rolled aside, firing a burst that sparked off the commander's armor, while Kalia darted in, her shards slicing into a gap at his shoulder. Green ichor sprayed, and Xytheran bellowed, backhanding her across the platform. She hit the ground hard, skidding to a stop, and Jake's vision went red. "You're dead," he roared, charging Xytheran with a fury he hadn't felt since Earth's ugliest wars. He tackled the Scorith, driving his pistol barrel under the commander's chin and firing point blank. The shot blew through Xytheran's head, his red eyes dimming as he collapsed, a smoking heap of armor and ichor. Jake stood over him, chest heaving, blood dripping from a cut on his brow. "That's Earth grit, you son of a bitch." Kalia was on her feet, limping but unbroken, and she crossed to him, her green eyes blazing. "You're insane," she said, but there was a warmth in her voice, a crack in her walls he'd fought damn hard to earn. She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the platform's edge as alarms blared, the base waking up to their rebellion. "We're not out yet," Jake said, scanning the chamber. The stimulators were still humming, crates of diamonds stacked high, and soldiers pouring in from every door. He spotted a fuel line snaking along the wall, volatile, exposed. "Cover me," he told Kalia, sprinting for it as she took up position, slashing at anything that got close. He reached the line, ripping a charge from his belt and slapping it onto the pipe. "Fire in the hole," he yelled, diving back as Kalia ducked beside him. The explosion rocked the chamber, a fireball tearing through the crates and machinery, sending scores of soldiers scrambling. The platform groaned, tilting as the structure buckled, and Jake grabbed Kalia's hand, pulling her toward the exit. "Time to go." They ran, her long legs matching his stride, their bodies pressed close as debris rained around them. Her chest heaved against his arm, her hips brushing his with every step, and even in the chaos, he felt that pull, raw, undeniable. They burst out of the collapsing base, the night air hitting them like a wave, thick with that pheromone scent. The outpost burned behind them, a beacon of their defiance, and Jake pulled Kalia into his arms, his hands sliding down to grip her backside, lifting her slightly as he pressed her against him. "You're incredible," he growled, his lips crashing into hers in a kiss that was all heat and hunger. She kissed him back, fierce and desperate, her hands clutching his shoulders, her breasts soft and full against his chest. His fingers dug into her hips, then slid up, squeezing her curves through the undersuit, and she moaned into his mouth, a sound that set him ablaze. "Jake," she gasped, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes, her blue skin flushed pink. "Not here." He grinned, breathless, his hand still roaming her. "Later, then. Promise." She nodded, a spark of mischief in her gaze, and they turned, running hand in hand into the crimson night, the wild swallowing them whole. The twin suns of Xythera-9 hovered low, their crimson lights spilling over the capital city like molten fire, bathing the grand plaza in a glow that pulsed with life. Jake Blaze Carver stood at its heart, his boots rooted to the shimmering stone, his tactical suit ripped and clinging to his sweat-slick frame. The fabric hugged his broad shoulders and muscled chest, marked with the grime of battle, but his sharp blue eyes burned with a fire no fight could dim. Beside him, Kalia stood like a vision carved from the wilds, her sky-blue skin catching the light, her long legs and graceful curves wrapped in a flowing robe that shimmered with every breath. Her emerald green eyes locked onto his, fierce and unwavering, and he reached for her hand, his rough fingers brushing hers, a silent anchor in the storm they conquered. The plaza hummed with Xytherans. Hundreds of blue-skinned figures gathered under the towering palace of red crystal, its spires glinting like spears against the bruised sky. A council elder stepped forward, her voice cutting through the thick, pheromone-laden air. "You've torn down shadows we couldn't face," she said, her gaze shifting from Kalia to Jake. "A human and a Xytheran, bound by strength, have given us a new dawn." She gestured to a crate at the plaza's center, diamonds, glittering like captured stars, harvested not through chains but through the will of her people. "Our pride, reclaimed." Jake's chest tightened with a pride that ran deeper than victory. It was purpose, forged in blood and fire. He'd landed here, chasing a mission, a resource for Earth's ambitions, but he'd found a fight worth dying for, a woman worth living beside. "Earth doesn't bow," he said, his voice a low growl that rolled over the crowd. "And neither do you." The plaza exploded, a roar of triumph shaking the ground, and Kalia's lips curved into a smile, small, rare, and devastatingly beautiful, a reward he'd earned through every bruise and scar. She leaned in, her breath warm against his ear. "You're too loud, Blaze," she murmured, her melodic hum sending a shiver through him. "But I wouldn't change it." Her fingers tightened around his, and he grinned, that crooked, cocky flash that had carried him through hell. The ceremony dragged on. Speeches, cheers, the clinking of those reclaimed diamonds. But Jake's mind was elsewhere, snagged on the heat of her touch, the promise in her eyes. The Scorith were ash, their threat buried in the wilds, and now the future was theirs. As the suns dipped lower, staining the sky a deep purple, Kalia tugged his arm, pulling him from the crowd. "No more words," she said, her green eyes glinting with something wild and tender. "Follow me." He didn't hesitate. Hell, he'd have chased her across the stars and let her lead him through the glowing streets, past towers of living crystal and vines that pulsed faintly with energy. The palace loomed ahead, its red walls shimmering like a living flame, and they slipped inside, the heavy doors sealing behind them with a soft hum that locked the world out. Her chamber was a marvel, walls of translucent crystal casting a warm, crimson glow, the air thick with that sweet, earthy scent that was all her. A massive bed stood at the center, draped in silken vines that shimmered faintly, their tendrils curling like a lover's whisper. Kalia turned to him, her robe slipping to the floor in a soft rustle, revealing her sky-blue form in the gentle light. Her skin glowed, smooth and radiant, her long legs stretching endlessly, her silhouette a blend of power and grace that hit him like a punch. Her jet-black hair spilled down her back, brushing her spine, and her pointed ears twitched as she stepped closer, her presence a force he couldn't resist. "I need you here," she said, her voice a low, trembling hum that sank into his bones. "With me, always." She reached for him, her hand steady as she pulled him toward the bed, and Jake shed his torn shirt in one swift motion, letting it drop to reveal his battle-hardened frame, broad chest slick with sweat, muscles taut from the fight, scars tracing his story. Her green eyes darkened, tracing him with a quiet intensity, and she drew him down beside her, their bodies close, the air between them alive with heat. He caught her hand, pressing it to his chest, letting her feel the steady thud of his heart. "You've got me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not leaving." She shifted closer, her skin brushing his, warm and electric, and he felt that spark ignite, a flame that had smoldered since the wilds. Her breath caught, her eyes locking onto his, and he saw it, trust, fierce and deep, a bond no enemy could break. She moved first, her hand sliding up his arm, her fingers tracing the curve of his shoulder as she pressed herself against him. Jake's hand found her waist, his palm resting there a moment before sliding lower, brushing the curve of her hip, feeling the strength beneath her smooth skin. She shivered, a soft sound escaping her lips, and he grinned, his fingers tightening briefly before moving up, grazing the side of her form, hinting at the fullness he'd fought beside. "You're something else," he murmured, his voice thick with awe, and she leaned in, her forehead resting against his, her breath warm against his lips. Sweat beaded on her blue skin, not just from the heat of the room, but from the fire between them. It traced her neck, rolled down her arms, glistened along her back, and as it fell, it hardened, tiny diamonds scattering across the silken vines, their soft clinksome melody of their closeness. Jake watched, mesmerized, as a drop slid from her shoulder, catching the red light before crystallizing mid-air, landing with a faint plink. "You're a damn wonder," he breathed, his hand sliding to her lower back, resting there as more gems formed, a testament to their shared strength. Kalia's ears twitched, her skin flushing a faint pink, but her eyes held no shame, just a radiant warmth. "It's us," she whispered, her voice breaking softly as she pressed closer, her body fitting against his like they were made for this. His hand moved again, brushing her hip, then higher, tracing the line of her side with a gentle pressure that made her breath hitch. More sweat flowed, down her arms, across her back, each bead a diamond, a crown of their victory, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as the gems multiplied, shimmering around them. They sank into the bed, her body warm against his, her head resting on his chest as her hair spilled over his skin like ink. His hand rested on her hip, fingers brushing the curve there, a quiet claim that felt right after everything they'd faced. She sighed, her breath soft against his neck, and he felt the tension of the wilds melt away, replaced by this, a stillness more powerful than any battle. "You're my triumph," he said, his voice low and steady, and she tilted her head, her green eyes soft but fierce. "And you're mine," she replied, her hum resonating through him. She shifted, her hand resting on his chest, and he caught it, pressing it there as a diamond fell from her arm, glinting in the crimson light. "A piece of us," he said, grinning, and she smiled, a full, unguarded smile that warmed him more than the sun's. The night deepened, the palace glowing around them, and they stayed close, her body pressed to his, the diamonds a quiet chorus of their bond. When she spoke again, her voice was a whisper, laced with certainty. "You're staying." It was a truth, not a question, and he tilted her chin up, meeting her gaze. "Got a universe to see," he said, his grin softening. "But you? This is where I belong. Plus these," he held up a diamond, winking, "need more study. For science." She laughed, a soft, melodic sound that filled the room, and leaned up to kiss him, slow, deep, her lips lingering like a promise. "Earth's never seen a man like you," she murmured, her green eyes glinting with mischief and something deeper, love, fierce and true. He smirked, his hand resting on her hip, giving it a playful squeeze. "And Xythera's never met a bastard like me," he replied, his voice thick with pride. "We're just warming up." Outside, the wilds pulsed, the twin suns sinking below the horizon, and the palace stood as a beacon, red light and living crystal framing their victory. Jake held her, her diamonds scattered like a legacy, and knew he'd found more than a mission. He'd found her, a warrior, a partner, a flame to match his grit. Human and Xytheran, bound in triumph and passion, their future burned brighter than the stars.